to another episode of the New York Information Security Podcast. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Sounil Yu. Thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. How are you?
Thanks, David. Great. It's I'm actually in North Carolina, and it's super humid here. But it's great to be out and about. Yeah,
I love your natural background. Typically people have this, greenery background, but it's, it's virtual, so not real. So I appreciate seeing that for once. Hey, your name, Sounil, is synonymous with innovation in cybersecurity. And I don't say this lightly. You've gone through a tremendous career in cybersecurity, and you provided very much a thought leadership in a lot of different areas, including one that's like your baby, your birth child is the cyber defense metrics. But before we, and I highly recommend reading that book. It's really succinct and more so, it's I think it's if you ask me, it's a manual for cybersecurity professionals that can be used in a lot of different ways. But before we jump into that, because I know you've done a lot of this speaking engagement, but I don't know how many of this speaking engagement you actually covered a little bit of your career path and how you got to work on these thesis of yours. So why don't we kind of, if you don't mind, just jump into that for a little bit, kind of dwell on your career path and how you got started.
Sure. Yeah. So I got started early on when I was still in college, where I ran help desk for the college I was at, and that's really where I got my hands really into technology. Subsequent to college, I continued to do some help desk work, but eventually went into consulting. What
did you take, by the way, Sounil? What was your major?
So this is actually, you're bringing up actually a really interesting point. So I majored in electrical engineering and economics, and I essentially minored in a lot of different subjects. So that included computer science, physics, math, sociology, psychology, and philosophy. So a pretty broad range of skill sets. And I love learning, and I love connecting the dots between all these disparate subject areas, which I think, I don't think people are going to be able to follow that sort of path. But I think the notion of cybersecurity being this very diverse domain that involves a multitude of subjects is actually something that is really important. And I think it's encapsulated well in a book called Range by David Epstein. Really wonderful book that characterizes the advantage that people who have range or have a broad set of skill sets can have over those who have a very deep singular skill set, specialization in one particular area.
I want to just double click on what you just said. It's so these are so your major are very difficult topics. Yes, electrical engineering and the economics. I would say probably the two toughest disciplines out there for undergrad in college. And why did you decide to pick those? And typically when people are doing this, they're just very busy, like just trying to get ahead. How did you manage to get all these other kind of very round? I know I took elective in college, but they're not that many. And typically I took the easy electives so I can bump up my GPA. And you're laughing because, that's true. What kind of propelled you to have that curiosity early on?
Well, for one, it was the tuition, you pay one tuition, it's all you can eat. So, I ate as much as I could. And, unfortunately, I think some of my grades suffered just because I had so many different classes to take, and none of them were, I think, they were all for grades. And so it meant that I had to actually work at it. But the course, it was just really fascinating to learn about these subjects and to do it in a place where, you can see people driving the forefront of that as far as research and other areas of investigation. So anyway, it was really great. I just enjoyed the learning aspect of college, and really went in with the perspective of, hey, we're paying a lot of money for this. Let's make the most of it.
And then you were, it sounds like you were super educated, but then you're like, your first kind of role out of college was a help desk support role, right?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
And yeah. And so granted, I haven't been able to use my first job out of school really had nothing to do with engineering or economics.
Yeah, that's fine.
But it doesn't matter. It's the skills that you learn from both are actually extremely helpful in a multitude of subjects. But I've always I always loved IT, and it was through IT that I entered security, and it was through IT that I first learned about what a firewall is, or why we needed various endpoint protections. So, and this is actually, I think, one of the key aspects to what I've talked about with the cyber defense matrix around this broad range of skill sets. So I did help desk, which is very endpoint centric. In electrical engineering, one of the things I learned a lot about is network engineering as well. So I learned about the network. I basically minored in computer science. So I learned about application development. I basically minored in math, so I learned about cryptography. And I I almost majored in sociology and psychology, which lets us understand people really well and users and how they behave. Well, I just described five of the asset classes of the cyber defense matrix: devices, applications, networks, data, users. And to have really this broad range of understanding across these different asset classes, it just happens to very much mirror even my academic background. So again, I don't think everyone can be in that same sort of boat to be able to have that broad range of academic training, so to speak. But oddly enough, I actually did have the benefit of having that.
And then you propelled your way pretty quickly to some very senior roles in the kind of the financial industry. How did that take place? And I know we can't, fast forward to like 10x in terms of the career path, but just maybe talk to me a bit about maybe some significant, forks in the road that you decide to take.
Sure. So that propelling that wasn't as fast as you may characterize it, but I spent many years.
Sounil.
Yeah. I spent many years in consulting, specifically at an organization called Booz Allen Hamilton. And what I think I really enjoyed about consulting is that you're forced to remake yourself on a regular basis. You are oftentimes challenged to be the expert in something that you really just kind of learn. So it's kind of funny when you think about consulting and what you're hiring, the kind of people that you're actually hiring to be your experts. But anyway, consulting does provide an outside view, and you want to quickly understand the material well enough to be able to then provide interesting perspectives to your customers and clients. So the perspective I would have with consulting is that you always constantly have to remake yourself and learn new things, which I think is actually, again, pretty central to one of the key requirements for security itself. Security, we're always having to, at best, stay ahead of the attackers, but usually just keeping up with the attackers. And it means that you have to constantly reinvent yourself. You think you secured something pretty well. Well, guess what? There's something new that you need to learn to be able to secure the next thing that comes up. So consulting, I think, was a great experience because, again, it forced us to have to reinvent ourselves on a regular basis, create new things. And part of my job at the time was running essentially an innovation function there as well, where my team was in charge. My team was the team that basically created a lot of new capabilities for the organization, particularly in the space for cybersecurity. Now, what happened subsequent to that was the CISO at Bank of America at the time knew of my role and the type of capabilities that I was building. And the CISO said, hey, come over to Bank of America and basically do something similar, where I would have the chance to build out new capabilities. Well, when I first got there, though, one of the other tasks that the CISO asked me to do was, I have all these vendors pounding on my door. Can you go take a look at them and just sort out what they do and see whether or not they can satisfy our needs? Well, I came in to build, but I was also asked to consider buying, right? And this is a perennial challenge that we all have. Do I buy versus build? Well, I had that challenge almost immediately. And working for a company like Bank of America, of course, people know we have a pretty decent security budget. and there's a very, very long line of vendors who wanted my time and attention to look at their product. And that actually was the genesis of why I came up with the cyber defense matrix. I had all these different products out there that I couldn't make heads or tail over. I didn't understand what they did in a way that helped me systematically understand what problem they were solving. And so necessity is the mother of invention, and the need that I had was a system that I could use to better organize all the things that I saw.
It's so interesting, and it's also interesting you admitted that the fact that sometimes you were consulting and being considered an expert, despite the fact they didn't have, it's pretty nice to revelation there. You know what they define an expert, right? It's somebody who's at least 100 miles away. So.
Well, yeah, and I hinted at this along the way. And by the way, let me bring in a little bit about the economic side. So one of my fascinations is behavioral economics, and it's all a study about cognitive biases. And one of the cognitive biases that we have is just taking what we call an inside view, just a view of what there's all these biases that causes us to not consider information from external sources. Well, a consultant is an external source, and the consultant provides an outside view. And even if the consultant says things that you already know and have heard from other people internally, by having an outside view, it helps you basically see the bigger picture. And that helps ward off a cognitive bias that we all have, that oftentimes results in poor decisions. So yeah, a consultant, they may not actually tell you anything new outside of what you may already know, but just having that outside view that says, yes, you are either correct or no, you should consider these other things, is actually extraordinarily helpful. So I don't want to bash consultants.
No, and you don't at all. Like, absolutely not. I think you're spot on. I think that there's a lot of we're creatures of evolutionary process of millions of years, and a lot of things we carry, despite the fact that we're way more advanced than they are. Our cousins who lived in the caves are. We still have a lot of the traits that were developed through many years of evolution. So it's just natural way to do that. And you brought up a really good point, is the fact that cybersecurity has it's a fascinating topic and discipline. The fact that you can bring in a lot of different disciplines and apply them, which you just did, because that part of the cyber defense metrics is you take a lot of areas of discipline and combine them into something that we can later use. And it's really also interesting that you, as a consultant, you basically, it's a very expensive way to tell you what you already know,
Unfortunately,
but it's necessary. So tell me a bit about that experience. So so first of all, again, let's, as you mentioned, I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, which you are, that basically went out and developed something or created something because they saw a gap somewhere, and they didn't see an off-the-shelf solution for that. And you essentially developed a product that wasn't available out there to, review and evaluate technologies out there that potentially can fit your organization. But later on, you found out that framework is very much applicable to many other use cases, right? Talk to me about that. And this is, by the way, when I asked you prior to this interview, I asked you what's the next step for you. So you mentioned that specifically you were looking for additional use cases, even though there are quite a few. And so if anybody who's reading this book, has a potentially another idea of how this framework can be used, feel free to reach out to Sounil. But talk to me about kind of the discovery that the framework can be used to other use cases, and very successfully so.
Sure. So there's a quote that I have that I use from George Box that I love. So the quote is, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So the cyber defense matrix is a model, and it is definitely wrong, but it is useful in being able to help us understand reality. So it's wrong because it's not a complete representation of reality, but it has a lot of utility. And what I'm discovering is it has a lot more utility than I had originally started off with, or that I could imagine. I have found that, when I shared the matrix of other people, there's some people that I inevitably run into who would say, I actually came up with something similar many years ago, and in fact, here it is, and I see it, and has some resemblances to the matrix. And I'm like, great, what did you do with it? And oftentimes what I've seen is it kind of stops there. It's like, here's an interesting way to organize it, whatever they were trying to organize at the time. I think I had the privilege at Bank of America of being able to explore further. Certainly, I had a use case that was relatively novel in terms of putting vendors into them, and that was a pretty popular use case by and large. But the ability to explore and the opportunity to explore further was what I had the luxury of being able to do. And in doing so, I discovered tons more use cases. And what I think was particularly interesting was just when I started seeing a lot of pattern matching opportunities, that's when it started to get really interesting, because I discovered that this multidisciplinary approach that we talked about moments ago is one aspect of the matrix. But the other aspect that's really fascinating is that these patterns of how we approach each of these different discipline areas repeats itself. So this notion, for example, whether it's for users or for devices, let's say I want to fix something, I want to patch something. Okay, well, patching a device, we know what that means, but what does it mean to patch a human? And it turns out patching a human is basically security training and awareness. So the concept applies. It follows this notion of how do we patch something. And we don't call it patching a human. We just call it, giving them training. But effectively, that's patching a human, right? So there's these parallels that emerge that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and an unexpected use case of the cyber defense matrix.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So what's your favorite use case of all? And by the way, this conversation is completely unscripted. Sounil did not get any questions up front. And he's doing a phenomenal job, tackling some of these questions. What's your favorite use case? If you could pinpoint a couple, maybe a couple of these that you can say, this is unexpectedly great, in terms of what this matrix can do.
Yeah. As far as a favorite is concerned, I kind of, there are many that were like, wow, that's pretty cool. So one was the one I just mentioned in terms of the pattern matching. Another use case that emerged was helping me understand the difference between where I have a control versus what the control is actually trying to address. And actually, some of them. So apologies for those who I'm going to cause their heads to hurt. So the use cases that I actually found to be most intriguing are the ones where it actually goes multidimensional. And unfortunately, that also really hurts my head too. I can imagine it may hurt other people's heads, because you're now having to. It's already hard enough to think in 2 dimensions. But in my head, I've now formulated these very complex, multidimensional models of the matrix, which incorporate various facets that I realize you can start organizing into the matrix. And so those are the ones that are right now most intriguing for me. I don't know if I would say they're my favorite as much as they're just like, wow, this is something that is starting to reveal really interesting insights. And so again, one of those insights is not just characterizing what you're trying to secure, but also where you do it, and whether or not this pattern of where you do it versus what you're trying to secure ends up being something that we can repeat and reuse. So there's just as a quick aside, like for example, like a WAF secures an application, it protects an application, but a WAF lives on the network. Okay, so and this came up because I was trying to map these products and capabilities into the right white boxes. And when I was trying to think about where a WAF fits, one of the common mappings that I've heard from other people would be that they mapped it to the network. Well, again, that's not that's not exactly right because it's trying to protect an application. But they aren't entirely wrong because it does live on the network. And so this situation resulted in a quandary where I was trying to figure out how to map these things. But at the same time, it revealed an interesting dynamic that's happening that I could actually represent in the matrix as well. And then gave us other opportunities to say, well, I'm trying to secure an application, but how do I have whatever that's trying to secure it also live on the device or within the application itself, or maybe even on the data? And some of these things don't quite compute. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I discovered that, yes, there actually is a way to secure an application by living on the device. And there's actually, I won't name companies because we're not trying to promote products or anything, but there is actually a company that was very successful in doing it that way. And it's like, wow, there you go. There's actually patterns here that we can discover. And there's plenty of opportunities for startups to build things off of those approaches as well. So anyway, that's pretty exciting because it opens up this world of new opportunities and new ways of doing things.
So, I have, every time you answer, I have so many questions. I have to make sure I keep them in order. So one I'll ask you is so you talked about almost, creating a multi-dimensional matrix now with more than one dimension. Have you ever considered, creating almost like a decision support system that automate this process where maybe there's a bot ask you all those questions and then it spits out a kind of recommendation based on the model?
Yeah, and there are actually a couple of startups that are trying to do this. At the same time, I would say the matrix isn't, it's wrong, right? It's useful for certain things. It's definitely not useful for other things. It's very useful for strategic decision making. So if you're trying to make a decision at the 30,000 foot level, it's actually extremely useful. If you're trying to make a decision at the 100-foot level, it's not going to be useful at all. So for anything that's very tactical, there's going to be better models for representing that information and helping make that decision.
And would you say that, let's say you're a vendor and potentially, would you be able to create a better roadmap to, if you look at the matrix and see where the gaps are and move the needle to that direction? Would that be useful on that side as well?
Yeah, and I had that captured in chapter 5 of the book, which is all about how to create an information security roadmap. I'm not sure if there are elements of the matrix that are useful for a vendor who's trying to build out a security product. And I think I actually captured that in chapter 8, which is all around natural movements of vendors and what directions they go to expand or to acquire new capabilities. But anyway, as far as the roadmap is concerned, the only, caution I would make is I can tell you how to get from New York to California, but I may not be able to tell you how to get around Manhattan. So the level of detail that's available in the matrix is going to be at this macro level. I can head west to go to California, and maybe a bit more, slightly more detail than that. But I definitely won't be able to help you navigate Manhattan, as far as the tactical level detail.
Yeah, so interesting. And we just kind of the post RSA, 2022, which you took part and you were speaker at. We see the ecosystem of tremendous number of vendors with tremendous amount of marketing budget, and so on. Is anything changed in terms of how vendors, relay information, disseminate information, provide, inside marketing and so on, or are we still stuck, back in the 2000, early 2000, the way that vendors market themselves?
Yeah, actually, I think, unfortunately, I think it actually got worse this year. And there's a specific reason why. So there was a report, and I'll send you a link, or you can publish the link later, but it was a link. It was a report about the market for lemons. And it was specifically as it pertained to security products, market for lemons. So lemons being basically products that don't work as advertised.
I think, Sounil, I think that comes to a lot. People know that expression from cars, I think.
Yes,
vehicles.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And in this report, it also mentioned the marketing spend that security companies have, and it was something like double the amount of normal IT companies, which is crazy if you think about it. But then you go to RSA, and what do you see? You see all this marketing, right? And people wasting money on stupid things like, booths that
without naming. So yeah, they do look amazing, and so without naming any names. So it got worse, but why? Well, it seems like sorry, guy, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No. So the why is because, and the analogy works best in this way. So the cyber defense matrix is essentially shopping aisles. One of these cases is to make it a shopping aisle for security. Well, and in general, if you walk into a grocery store and you're trying to buy hamburger buns, you know to go into the bread aisle. If you want to buy cucumbers, you know to go to the produce aisle. If you want to buy endpoint detection and response, you have no idea what aisle to walk into at RSA, right? It's just everywhere. Now, you do know because of the advertising that these particular companies that have the biggest marketing budgets, well, they may do endpoint detection and response. But if you walk into a grocery store and walk into the cereal aisle, you see name brands, right? Those are the ones with the big marketing budget. But you don't see the store brands. You don't even know what the store brands are. And guess what? The store brands are cheaper, right? And they may be pretty comparable to the store brand, to the name brands, but you don't even know what the store brands are. You have no concept of what these these companies that pour more money into product and less into marketing, you don't even know that they exist. Well, in the past, I knew that they existed because I visited them, and they're oftentimes on the periphery of the expo hall. And so I specifically went to the periphery of the expo hall, and there were no vendors there. They were all gone. So I was like, I don't see the store brand anymore. The companies that have very little marketing budget, but really just have a product that works. And I think this is where we've taken a step back, where we spend more on marketing, we spend less on or we don't make the store brands easier to discover. And as a result, you have a bunch of buyers who basically just buy the name brands without really even realizing that store brands exist. So I don't want to necessarily incentivize that model. I want to be able to go back to a model where we could say, look, all you big marketing budget companies, we actually want to make sure people know there are alternatives to your brand. And here they are. And we want to emphasize those because they need more attention, arguably, than you do. Okay. In fact, we want to have you lower your marketing budget because it's, I think, profligate and quite wasteful. Let's instead pour that into actual product, make the product better as opposed to just making it more recognizable. Now,
the old saying, you never got fired for buying IBM. Are executives still comfortable buying the no-name brands and maybe some of the kind of or the off brands when potentially there's less confidence in those products? What's your take on it? Because I think that's a lot like why a lot of smaller vendors with very high capabilities struggle. Mm-hmm. Is because they don't have that brand recognition and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, or, vicious cycle where they don't have the spend to market, and then they don't get the customers because they don't have the spend. And then it's like a, vicious cycle, and the other almost winners take it all is, the guys that have, tremendous budget and they plaster their names on bulletin, boards and buses and so on. Those are the ones that get the most exposure. What's your take on that?
Yeah. And certainly there's a degree to which there's a broader ecosystem need here. So the team that used to run NSS Labs have now moved on to something called cyber ratings. And then, of course, we know MITRE has their evaluation function as well. I think it's going to be really up to, it's going to require more attention and investment into those particular spaces where we can actually get good ratings on these products. So that when someone says, look, I went with this name brand, but they rate it pretty high according to these unbiased evaluations, I think that's the stopgap that I need to be able, or I think a lot of us are going to need to say, look, you can't fire me for picking what was a decent option for the price that we're paying. But unfortunately, until then, it's like who made that choice for this particular product? Unfortunately, that's the case.
And without naming names, there's certain magic quadrants that you have to pay a lot of money to be part of and subscribe, which a lot of like smaller vendors cannot do. And again, it's so what do you recommend for other executives that? And again, coming from you carries a lot of weight because you are a buyer at one of the largest banks in the world, if not the largest bank in the world. What do you recommend for an executive or someone who's looking at technologies out there and does not necessarily wants to, again, just pay premium for potentially the same product, wants to go, and the economy is such companies will have to cut costs, right? So, and that's including like the cybersecurity budget. So what do you recommend aside from looking at other types of I guess review, reports mechanism, any other tools out that you can take to in order for you to make a decision?
Yeah, so CIS, Center for Internet Security, also has their top 18 top security controls, and it's prioritized in order. So I think that's probably one of the first things to really consider before you even consider a product. Is sort of to say what controls are most relevant or most useful for us, and you start going down the list. And of course, as a part of that, you look at the products that are associated with that. The step that I like to take, it's just time, but I'd love to have a community that can help me do this, which is essentially to list all those different products in that box, in that aisle, so that we can easily discern which ones are the store brands. We know what the we know what the catalogs and the posts are for the cereal brands, but I don't necessarily know what the store brand is for all these different boxes that we see in the matrix. I could this past week when in San Francisco, I barely had time to go visit the expo hall just because of all the side meetings that we had. But for those who are able to actually spend the time to go find these companies and start capturing them in a systematic way, I think that's actually going to be super helpful. And there's already some work along these lines too. Richard Stennon's done some work here. Ed Amoroso at TaxCyber has also cataloged some of these. And so the compilation of that is what we kind of need to have to be able to understand what are some alternative products out there that we can potentially use in lieu of the major name brands that are out there. But again, the order in which we do it is also super important. I think the CIS top controls is a great way to think through that. And
it's interesting, you can use the cyber defense matrix to prioritize the CIS controls, right?
Yeah, and right, exactly. So the CIS actually, since version 7, has mapped to the matrix. So the matrix then, you can see it. In fact, I presented this at this past week at RSA, a slide that shows how they all map into the matrix.
And then on the flip side, if you're a vendor and you finally have the opportunity to meet with somebody like yourself at another company, what do you recommend in terms of like to make the most out of it, again, from that exposure and to potentially win that transaction?
It's the question of how you get CISOs to buy your product is a perennial one as well. At the end of the day, it does point to understanding the problem space of the CISO and saying, I know that you have a need for X. Well, here's a product that specifically addresses that problem. We unfortunately end up with point products that solve only that particular problem. But in some cases, that really kind of, if that meets the need, then that meets the need. Long ago, when I was at Bank of America, I complained that all we see are products and not platforms. And what happened shortly after that is every product manufacturer started calling themselves a platform instead, which isn't what I wanted. I wanted them to actually produce for me a platform.
So
and what do I mean
it's your
by
fault.
that?
You're a trendsetter.
Unfortunately, this was the wrong trend because it created more confusion. But I did have a slide back in 2016 in my RSA presentation that says, this is what I mean by a platform. This is specifically what I mean by a platform. And it actually used the cyber defense matrix to represent it. So a point product is something that solves a problem in only one box, which kind of makes sense, right? It's a point product that solves one particular problem. which is necessary at times. And if you have a product that you're selling and it does solve that one particular problem, then yes, that's what a CISO will buy. But it's oftentimes not needed. It's necessary, but not, in my view, sufficient for the long term, because what I need is something that will adapt with me and adapt with the changing conditions and the threat environment, because you'll solve this problem, but inevitably something else will emerge. And I'm going to want to bend metal and have your product try to solve this other problem too. Will it actually be able to do that effectively? No, not necessarily. But we are oftentimes that is something that we want to be able to see, that it can truly serve as a platform that solves a multitude of problems that can be solved by the practitioner, not by the vendor. Okay, so in other words, I need a true platform. In my view, is something that I tweak and I manipulate to solve a number of other problems that the vendor would never even imagine. That's what I would like to see in some of the products that we see out there. But some of that's wishful thinking. And unfortunately, now that I'm working at a startup, I've come to realize that platforms don't sell as well as products do, which is unfortunate. But
is that because, specifically because it takes a lot more, commitment from the client, as opposed
a lot
to
more commitment. It requires them to really understand the full breadth of what can be done. We oftentimes get the question of, well, wait, hold on. You seem to do 20 different things. What do you really do? And when you get those sort of situations, yes, you actually are now dealing with a true platform, because you can do 20 different things. But as I mentioned, it becomes harder to sell because you want to solve one particular pain point. And that's usually why people buy you.
And Sounil, I just want to be cognizant of the time. I know you have a hard stop, and I feel like we have to do a part B of this, because we haven't even dabbled into some of the topics that I wanted to dabble today. But one question before I ask you, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for any, consulting engagement, speaking engagement, whatnot. But before I ask you that question, we talk about some biases, and one of our biases is always the recency bias. We as security professionals, we always look at the kind of, okay, what are the latest security, breaches, and we go all out, we're trying to patch it and, eliminate those. And then we go off to the next one. How can we fix that collectively and make sure that we have some, because it seems like that's not working. We continuously kind of jump from one shiny, shiny breach to another, if I can call it that.
Yeah. So Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, he walks through all these biases, and then at the end of each chapter, he actually provides countermeasures to each bias. I don't recall the specifics for the recency bias one or availability bias. I think that's the specific bias here. But he does mention some specific ways to counter them by saying, well, have you considered what was the, let's look at this from a longer historical timeline to see, is this the most important thing? Or ask questions like, yeah, I understand that this is a pain point that you just recently experienced, but how does it compare to this other pain point that you mentioned last month, right? So there are things that we can do to counter these biases. And this is why I think also people ask me, what security book would I recommend? And my recommendation is these behavioral economics books like Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman. Because it actually helps us understand how we think and how we arrive at some of these poor security decisions better than pretty much any security book that I've read. So, anyway, it's these biases, unfortunately, do result in poor decision-making and poor choices in security. And so the best way to counter them is to understand that the bias exists, and then those specific steps to challenge our thinking, to force us from the system one quick, fast thinking that we oftentimes default to into something that's more deliberative and more rational in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, fascinating. What's the easiest way for people to reach out to you? I know your schedule is always super busy and fills up fast. So what's the easiest way?
Well, yeah. So you mentioned consulting. So I do have a full-time job, but if you're an IANS customer, then that's probably the best way to connect to me, because they handle everything. That's great. If you're not, then LinkedIn generally works if you have a decent intro. Twitter, not really. I'm on Twitter. I'm on all these social media, but that's not really a great way to connect with me. Actually, you know what? One of the best ways is the Cyber Defense Matrix website. So cyberdefensematrix.com, and at the bottom I have this form where you could just fill it out and say, "Hey, I'd love to connect on X, Y, and Z." So that definitely I try to pay attention to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sounil, very much for taking the time. And I highly recommend for anybody who's watching this to take a look at the model. Even though it's wrong, it can be very useful to a lot of folks. And get the book if you can. It's available on Amazon and all the other retailers, right? And I'm sure Sounil will be
just Amazon.
Maybe just Amazon. Well, I guess there's no other retailers anyway. And then feel free to approach Sounil and have him sign the book on the next conference, because he might probably be there. So until then, thank you very much, and be safe online as well as offline. Looking forward to seeing you in the next event.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sounil.